Hey, what's up, everybody? Alrighty, a little bit different of a show today. We're going to talk about the OGL, the Open Gaming License. We're going to talk about the SRD, the System Reference Document, and a whole bunch of stuff regarding changes that have been put forward. I don't want to say announced, put forward, suggested. And at the time of doing this, there's been some walkback. So originally I wasn't going to do this. I was going to wait. But I feel waiting is kind of pointless because there's a massive amount of reaction going on in the D&D community with third-party developers and contributors, streamers, podcasters, you name it. Everybody's doing it. Via Facebook Messenger, via Discord, via other places, a bunch of people have asked me to kind of dig into it a little bit and talk about it. So I'm going to do just that. I thought about how I wanted to do this, and I'm going to kind of break it down into what was, what is, what's suggested, and what will be. And give you a little bit of history and kind of talk about how all this came about. So if we go back to the early 2000s, this was kind of when 4th edition and stuff like that was kind of just on the horizon. The original OGL, the Open Gaming License, which was 1.0A, was for licensing 2nd edition, and the idea was it gave you the opportunity to create content for Dungeons & Dragons as a third-party content creator. As long as you adhered to the SRD, the System Reference Document, which kind of details out a whole bunch of stuff, then you could put out and make money and publish third-party content. So it was kind of a public copyright license, as it were. Now, it was originally penned by a man called Ryan Dancy, and he worked kind of very tightly with some attorneys on the language, but he was the one that really kind of come up with the concept and the intent of the document and what it was about. And the idea, as I said, was to allow people to create third-party content, put it out there, and make money. So there were a lot of people at that time that didn't like that idea. They didn't want to do it. They thought it was a bad idea. Ultimately, they were wrong. One of the things that allowing third-party creators to produce does for you is it allows you to solidify your fan base. It expands your reach. And it allows people to acquire more content than you can produce. I mean, if you actually look at, since 5th edition came out, if you look at how many actual Wizard of the Coast products there are out there compared to third-party products, it's insanely different. So, you know, this was kind of one of the things that kind of happened. So we had 2nd edition, and then we had 3rd edition, which, without going into too much detail, wasn't very polished, had some issues. So very quickly, off the heels of 3, they come up with some updated books, modified and kind of hashed rules, which we all know till now either love or hate as 3.5. The Open Gaming License was the intent, and this was something that Ryan Dancy recently publicly said. When they created the OGL, the intent was for it to be perpetual and irrevocable. Now, what does that mean? It means the intent is, once it's out there, it's out there. You can't take it away, you can't kill it, you can't squash it. And the reason for that is, as a third-party creator, Why would you want to invest in creating a product to sell under a license that somebody could go and get rid of at any time? You wouldn't do it. You wouldn't produce under that. So that was the intent. That it wasn't going to be a license that it didn't have a shelf life. It wasn't written for a certain thing. Now, I will bring up a point in a moment about that. Because there is some kind of language out there that sort of does imply that there's a 35-year statute in U.S. law that possibly could be applied to this, which would mean, as this is currently about 23 years old, it would mean that in, eventually we get to a point, I think 2035, there would be a possibility that there was some language that will allow that to be squished. But even then, it would have some challenges. But we're going to dig into that a little bit more as we go through. So then 4th edition came out. And 4th edition brought forward something they called the GSL, which was a slightly different document. But at that time, the GSL that they brought out for 4th edition was more restrictive and more controlling. But as it was accepted universally at that point that the Open Game License 1.0a was considered irrevocable, it remained in use, which means you could still produce and maintain and put out content under the original Open Game License. You didn't have to adhere to the GSL. There was a guy called Andy Collins who at that time, he argued pretty hard to retain the Open Gaming License when Wizard wanted to restrictively push out, and lock things down with the GSL. So that was a thing that kind of really got hashed out, but ultimately it was kind of looked at and they said, look, the OGL is there, it works, you can't really revoke it. So, the OGL. So, while we can put out a GSL for 4th edition, we can't really do away with the OGL, the Open Gaming License. So, that being said, why all this has really come about is because with the announcement of 1D&D, Wizards began to change how they perceived Dungeons and Dragons as a product. And there were a few things that were said. Now, the CEO of Hasbro, which is Chris Cox, and the CEO of Wizards, which at the time is Cynthia Williams, there were some statements made. And the Hasbro kind of way of doing things, now that they're kind of over Wizards of the Coast, made a lot of people think about how to do things differently. And one of the things that Cynthia Williams said was D&D is under-monetized. Now, in other words, that means we're not making the money out of D&D that we should be. We should be making far more cash. And one of the biggest things that they thought about in all of this was, we are living in a digital market now, so we can monetize this through the digital market, through the digital medium. When everything was physical tabletop and books, how did you monetize your product? You sold books. You sold your core manuals, your core rule books. You sold game settings, campaign worlds like Forgotten Realms, Greyhawk, Ravenloft. You produced adventures. You added additional class material. You added additional race material, expanded things like spells. And that's how you did it. You pumped out published material and you put it into the world and people bought it. And that's how you did it. But here's the problem and again, before I want to preface, This is not a, I think this is good or bad. This is me talking about what are facts, what has happened. I will give some opinion pieces as well. I will talk about it from that point of view. But I don't want to kind of get off into the weeds and say, well, I think. But the reality of it is, from a business standpoint, you have a fundamental problem with certain things. For example, one of the things that we do know currently, that Wizards have pointed out, is while Dungeon Masters make up only 20% of the player base for Dungeons & Dragons, they are by far making up the largest amount of revenue spenders. Dungeon Masters are who spend the money. So if you look at it from a business standpoint, you've got 20% of your market share who is all spending a ton of money, and then you've got 80% of your market share that are spending little to nothing. They don't like that. You can understand that logic, right? So again, without kind of being too critical, from a business standpoint, there is some logic there. You can understand a viewpoint from a business standpoint, which, bear in mind, is all Hasbro is coming at this with. They don't have a passion for Dungeons & Dragons. They have a corporate entity that's job is to make money. I kind of digress. So one of the things that they looked at doing is we now live in a digital world. And living in a digital world, we have the ability to do things that we couldn't do back in the day. We couldn't do this during AD&D 2nd edition. You could barely do it during 3.5. There's a big change that they're kind of seeing. And why are you here? Well, you're here because Howreroll exists. We stream on Twitch. We are an actual play live stream that exists because of a virtual tabletop. The virtual tabletop is possible because we are in the digital world. We have the internet. We can do these things. So with that being said, that opens up a ton of additional ways that if you're a content creator or you own a game like Dungeons & Dragons, you can try to capitalize on. So one of the things that they wanted to do is they wanted to shift Dungeons & Dragons from being a game to what they would consider a 4-quadrant brand, a life brand, if you will. Being that would be made up with the tabletop role-playing game itself, video games, movies, and TV shows and other live broadcast media, and then toys and merchandising. So you're kind of splitting it out into 4 different groups. And at that point, you're able to say, we can make money here, we can make money here, we can make money here, we can make money here. Sure, the game itself is the core, but there's so much more money we can make by doing video games. There's so much more money we can make with movies and TV shows and other live media platforms. And the amount of toys and merchandising that we can pump out. If we can turn this into a life brand, people will wear the red, instead of just gamers, we want to make it to where everybody sees the red ampersand, the and dragon as something they identify with. And people will wear it. And we can merchandise and have all this additional stuff out there. So that is one of the ways that they wanted to unlock reoccurring spending. One of the other ways that they were looking at doing that is through locking down the virtual tabletop. So D&D Beyond, they acquired D&D Beyond, and they're realizing that there's ways that they can leverage that virtual tabletop to make more money. And if one D&D is built around the concept of that, as opposed to just being something that's in addition to that, it really kind of puts things in a little bit of a tighter marketing viewpoint for people. You kind of got to go that route. And by doing that, you're creating some different ways for your players to spend money. And the executives at that point publicly were known as saying, our executives are less worried about the design of the game than installing more on-ramps for players to spend money. Which again, from a marketing standpoint, from a business standpoint, if the player base is 80%, you can understand that. So, they're looking at it and pushing more on expanding D&D Beyond. Currently, they have about 13... Well, let me rephrase that. Prior to a few days ago, they had about 13 million registered users with D&D Beyond. But again, with the speed of digital and how fast you can get marketing material out there and product out there utilizing the digital platform, you can push out so much more purchasable and reoccurring spend material than you could before when you were just publishing, printing, and producing a few hardback books a year. And this is kind of pushing towards the Magic the Gathering model. When Magic the Gathering first came out, it came out with a core set. They updated that set, so you had alpha. Then they updated that set and you had beta. And then you started seeing a few expansions, and we had revised. But you used to, originally, back in the day, when the expansion packs were Arabian Nights, or, not Arabian Nights, but Ice Age, and some of these other early expansions, you only really saw a couple of expansions a year, and then you typically would see a reprint of the core cards. But look at it now. Now, they are flooding expansion after expansion after expansion after expansion, and getting it to where people have got to spend more and more and more and more and more and more money to keep up. And that, in a large point, is working for them with a product like Magic the Gathering. So, with all of that kind of being said, this was the intent. The intent of the new OGL is kind of shifting away from just providing an open gaming license for people to provide third-party content that is structured and fits within the standard reference document. But it is now allowing them to monetize and make money with that. And here's where we start to run into the problems. Now, we have... we're going to start out and kind of look at some of this stuff. And this is the original Open Gaming License. And I'm not going to go through this with a whole ton, because quite honestly, there's not a whole lot to it. As I said before, when Ryan Dancy made this, there was an intent. But going back to what we were talking about, the first sticking point that a lot of people have issues with is, can you create a new OGL 1.1 or a 1.2 or a 2.0, and in doing so, can you make the old OGL obsolete? So I'm going to draw your attention to this, what I've got highlighted here. So the grant and consideration, in the original OGL, it says, in consideration for agreeing to use this license, the contributors grant you a perpetual, worldwide, royalty-free, non-exclusive license with the exact term of this license to use the open game content. So, Cthulhu X, yeah, we're going to talk about that too. And as I said, here recently, Brian Dancy did a public interview, and he said that language there, the use of that language, perpetual, was designed to stipulate that once this was in place, you as a third-party content provider were safe to put out your product and know that at no point are they going to come back and say, oh, all bets are off. Can't do this anymore. get all of your product off the market, and we're going to sue you. So that was the point. Now, again, contracts are sticky, and intellectual product contracts, IP, even more so. Because it's there's a lot of stuff that goes off into the weeds of what you can do, what you can't do. A lot of it obviously is to do with the language. But the point seems to come down, does perpetual mean irrevocable? Now, as I said, there is a US law statute that says derivative works are only technically protectable for 35 years, right? So if you looked at it that way and said, if you wanted to say, well, this can't necessarily be held beyond 35 years because there's a statute that says, that's as long as you can protect that kind of stuff. We still would be looking at 2035 before the OGL would be dead and possible to do away with. So that is one of the things that a lot of people are kind of sticking to, saying, well, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. Here's what I'm going to point out. You can do anything you can do if somebody else is not willing to fight you in court. Now, if you're a little teeny independent producer, if they turn around and say, we're no longer going to honor the OGL and we're going to sue you, you will pay us this or we'll sue you. You only have one defense. You go to court, you fight it, and you make judges and you make lawyers decide how will this be played out. And at that point, there will become a statute. There will become a situation where people say, okay, this is now a thing. Now, one of the things that has already happened is, for example, Wizard of the Coast can copyright the use of their logo. Patenting. That's copywriting. They can do that. You are not allowed to produce something utilizing certain terminology or things like that, or they can happily sue you and will win, right? Everybody knows this. But it's already been ruled upon that you cannot copyright game mechanics. You cannot. It has already been ruled upon. So you can't say, well, we're going to own the use of this mechanic. But you can technically copyright the wording that goes with certain uses. For example, how many games do you know out there, card games, that you turn a card sideways to gain the effects of that card? What do we refer to that as? It's tapping. You tap that card. Nope. You can only tap a card if you're playing Magic the Gathering. Why? Because to tap a card, that terminology is actually something that they have a copyright on. They do. That being said, you can turn a card, you can use a card, you can twist a card all day long. As long as you don't say in your published game, tap the card, you can't do it. Okay? So that's a thing. And that being said, you can say, well, you cannot copyright the use of something like strength, charisma, dexterity. Can't copyright the use of dice to create statistics. No, you can't. Arguably, however, though, you could maybe get away with copywriting the stat block and saying, if somebody has strength, intelligence, charisma, constitution, and wisdom, if they use those 6, that block, we've got some grounds to go after you. Now, again, this is not stuff that's known. This is stuff that attorneys and lawyers and judges have to fight out in court. And only once a ruling is made Does it really exist? But you got to think about it. Who wants to do that? Well, you don't, because if you lose, you open yourself up to a ton of potential problems. So, hence we get into this situation where you don't want people to be able to continue to operate under the current OGL, because quite honestly, it doesn't make you enough money. You want a new game license. So this is, and again, I've got some things. We're not going to go through the whole thing because it's way too much language. But this was the initial, and I say initial, 1.1 release that caused everybody to proverbially lose their shit. It upset content creators to no end. It upset players, dungeon masters, and anybody that truly understood the intent of what was going on kind of really got a little bent out of shape. Now, again, before we kind of go digging into this document, which is what it's all about, I want to point out that when we talk about the original OGL language with the intent of the word perpetual, perpetual does not necessarily mean the same as irrevocable. Okay. But there is a piece of language in there that says in consideration of. Now, that doesn't sound like a very important term, but in fact, when you're dealing with the OGL and that type of document, it is incredibly important. And here's why. Because when you're dealing with a gratuitous license, it will usually hold up in a court of law when there is no benefit to the one using the license and a benefit to the person giving the license. In other words, if, under the OGL, the third-party content creator was the only one that benefited, there's a very reasonable chance that as the contract creator, Wizard of the Coast / Hasbro, could successfully argue their way out of that document in a court of law. Because they're getting nothing from it, right? However, it's very clear that that is not the case here, because in the OGL, both parties benefit, right? That's exactly right. So both parties do in fact benefit. So the legal statute has pretty much proven that in the case where both parties do benefit, they usually, and I say usually, every individual case is different, but the vast majority of them have sided with the contractor and not the contractee, not the contractor. So typically, if that was to go to court, that most of the way these things work out, they would side in favor of the third-party content creator. And because let's be real, if you are creating a third-party content and you're putting it out there, you're relying on the continuity of that license to be able to continue to produce your products, right? It's the expectation of the language to be perpetual. Can also be kind of synonymous with irrevocable, and unless you violate the terms of the open gaming license by not doing what you're told and doing things you shouldn't, and not putting the OGL out with your content, there's a separate agreement that allows you to use the D&D logo. That doesn't come as part of the OGL. And if you choose to use that, which allows you to put the big, almighty red and dragon on your product, that comes with a whole bunch of its own stipulations and restrictions. So it's a separate entity altogether. Some people want that because it makes it so much more official. Makes it look very official if you've got the logo. But to get the logo, But again, that is trademark law. That is not the open game license. It's a separate entity altogether. Okay. So the next thing that really comes into, before we dig into the 1.1, was, okay, so if we assume you're not going to win in a court of law and revoke the open gaming license, can you legally put out a separate license to govern one D&D? And the answer is pretty much yes, you can. It's what they already did with 4th edition. Remember we talked about at the beginning? You had the OGL, and then when they did 4th edition, they brought out the GSL. And they realized at that time, Wizards were like, yeah, we can't kill the OGL because it's irrevocable. But we can say, hey, if you want to make content for 4th edition, you're going to use this license. So they could do that here. They could do that. Which means that anybody that wanted to continue to produce for 3.5 or earlier editions and stuff like that could do so. And it would also mean that they couldn't wave the ban hammer and make you pull your products off the table. But as a third-party content developer, if one D&D is the new platform, the new game, that's what you want to produce for, right? Makes sense. Well, that's where we end up and where we're at. Again, this is a big document. We're not going to go through all of it, but we are going to kind of break down certain portions of this. So, there is commercial, there is non-commercial uses of this. Okay. And the governments of those are a little bit different. But I think it's fair to assume non-commercial means you're not going to try to make money. You're not going to sell the product. You're not going to try to put it out into the market and generate a revenue source. But to be clear, if you use any kind of crowdfunding, that makes it commercial. Even if your intent isn't to sell it, if you crowdfund the production of it and the creation of it, it kind of puts you in the commercial area. So that's the first little sticking point. If you accept subscriptions or membership fees or a Patreon fee, I'm not going to sell you my content. But if you pay $5 on Patreon, I'll give it to you for free. No, you don't get away with that. That's commercial. Because the requirement is a payment to get the content. A subscription to get the content. If you say this is out there for free, and if you want to donate to me because I put the work in, that's a little bit different. That's a little bit of a sticky point because it's not a requirement. You're not forcing somebody to pay. But how you put that out there can still be, or buy me a coffee, right? How you put that out there can still open you up to legal jeopardy. Because there's a point where they can argue. If I was, and I'll use Howreroll as an example, we do not ask for subscribers. You never hear us say, please subscribe. We don't ask for donations unless it's for a charity stream. And at the end of this, I'm going to talk about an upcoming charity stream that we're going to have. But you do so knowing that those donations are specifically for that charity. We don't even ask you live to hit the follow button. We don't do any of that. So if you choose to donate to Howreroll, that's a choice that you make. However, if I was to sit here and say, oh my God, you have no idea how many hours of work this is and how tired this is, and we have a ton of expenses to make this happen, and I know that you don't need to donate, but I'm going to be honest with you, we may not be here next month or next year if you don't. Okay, now at that point, it could be argued that you are putting the way you're spinning it is you're utilizing kind of like a guilt trip methodology to get those donations in. And if you take it too far, there is a possibility that someone could sue and win and say you were doing it for a commercial reason. Now, one of the things I'm going to point out also is the original OGL referred to tabletop role-playing games and the production of such. It didn't really have much to do with live broadcasts, streaming, or digital content, because it didn't exist. But we have that now. So, with that being said, the new OGL works a little different. Now, what does the commercial license mean to a small creator? Now, again, at this point, I want to point out, while 1.1 was initially leaked, and even though they tried to say, oh, that was just a leak, that was never our intended document, I will highlight this point here, when we get down to it at the bottom here, about the date that they said it was going to come into effect. But before we get to that, basically, here's where we come down to numbers, okay? So, those making under $750,000 a year using SRD-based content and the OGL, that's one little kind of number to remember, okay? And then there are some other numbers that we're going to kind of highlight on as we go through. But these are all things that matter in the 1.1 that did not matter in the original OGL because it was irrelevant. So, moving forward, hugely successful businesses that generate more than $750,000 of annual revenue will be expected to pay royalties of 20 to 25% to Wizards of the Coast. Now, that right there is something that is very different than the original OGL, and rightly so, a lot of people are very upset about. But then you're sitting there thinking, yeah, but if you're making $750,000, you're not a little micro producer. You're Paizo, you're Kobold Press, you're Green Ronin, you're some of these other, or you're Chaosium. But that's not where they stop. Now, going what we just mentioned before, with this 1.1 being leaked, and they said, oh, that was never meant to be an intended document. Bullshit. I'll say it bullshit. Here's why. Because it says, income from any SRD-based D&D content you create on or after January 13th, 2023. That date is on the document. It's the 15th of January. The intent was this was going into effect Friday and you were going to be held under it. Okay, that's the reality. Now, as we kind of scroll down here further, here's the next thing that I want to point out. Usable D&D content. This is Dungeons & Dragons content that is included in the SRD, including basic game mechanics and curate sections of classes, monster spells, and items that allow you to make content compatible with Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Okay? So first of all, that's all covered.
What the what?
Rather Shane, thanks buddy. That's all covered. But on top of that, we move to this piece of statement. To be clear, the OGL, now again, we're talking 1.1, not 1.0A, because again, different world when it was created, these things didn't apply. But now the OGL, at the time of creating this, says, To be clear, OGL non-commercial only allows for creation of role-playing games and supplements in printed media and static electronic file format. It does not allow for anything else, including but not limited to things like videos, virtual tabletops, VTT campaigns, computer games, novels, apps, graphic novels, music, songs, dance, pantomimes. You may engage in these activities only to the extent allowed under the Wizards of the Coast fan content policy, or a separate agreement between you and us. So, if you are a third content provider, it suddenly really limits how you can put out that content and what type of content you can put out under the OGL. A lot of people were very upset about that. The next thing that really kind of like threw the, the fox in the hen house is you agree that we own copyright, trademark, and patented rights, if any, in the licensed content and unlicensed content. We reserve all rights not expressly given to you through this agreement. You agree to include any copyright or other right notices, including with the licensed content in your licensed work, and you may not impose any additional differences or inconsistent terms or conditions with respect to the licensed content in any license you grant to any licensed work. In short, doesn't matter what you produce, we own it. And we can produce it, and we can duplicate it, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it, and you're giving away your right to even argue it in court. That last part probably wouldn't hold up, incidentally, from what I understand. Because there are certain things you can't do. You can't give away your rights to be indemnified against certain types of things. I used to teach martial arts, as some of you know. I ran some schools. We had an indemnity document that said, you can't sue us if you get hurt or even if you die. That only applies as long as I did everything right. If you trip over a broom that shouldn't be there and you break a leg because of that, that is my negligence, and you are no longer indemnified for that purpose. I could have been sued. This document is trying to basically say you're giving away your rights to sue us as well. So what if it's decided? What if termination happens? So say we're going to terminate the agreement. Upon termination of this agreement by Wizards of the Coast, you will cease all sales and distribution of your licensed works. Yes, folks, that means everything you've done up to now, if you suddenly don't like this agreement, you got to cease and desist everything you've done. And you are obliged to pay all royalties that survive the termination of this agreement, which basically means you're still going to have to pay them no matter what, right? There's also the indemnity clause here. If you get in legal trouble or get us in legal trouble, bottom line, you're responsible. You pay the bills, not us. So that's a big thing. Now, going back down to some of the guts on what we talked about commercially. We had those different tiers. So here we're talking about those. Leveling up under this agreement, okay? So here we go. This agreement covers all commercial uses, whether they're profitable or not. Now bear that in mind. Profitable or not. That you appear to have achieved great success. This is consistently meeting or exceeding the expert tier qualifications below from producing the OGL commercial content. We may reach out to you for a more custom and mutually benefiting license agreement. In other words, hey, if you're kicking ass and taking names, we might talk to you and give you a better deal. The initial tier. So this is the initial tier that applies to you. If you have registered at least one licensed work, but have not generated $50,000 or more in total gross revenue. for the commercial product in a given year, then that is your tier. If what you create doesn't bring in more than, and again, I want to point out some of the specific languages that they use. Let me refine that part here. This here, gross, not profit, gross. In other words, if your gross income was $50,000, you may only have made $5,000 in profit, but if your gross was $50,000, here's where you're at, right? Then there's the intermediate tier. If your license works have generated more than $50,000 in a total revenue, but less than $750,000, that is your tier. The expert tier is if you are generating more than $750,000 a year. So, this is where we get down to what does that mean? What does that really mean? Well, first of all, you have to register with this particular OGL to be able to produce the content. And when you do, you're in a how much money do I think I'm going to make state. So you might start out here, but after a while... yes, Giant Rat Guy, if you sign this, they own anything you produce. They can use it, they can reproduce it, modify it, you own nothing. They can take it. Oh, absolutely. It absolutely says that. So, reporting. As soon as you make $50,000 in gross revenue for a particular year... This is kind of hilarious to me, this part. Revenue means any income you make from selling a works license under the agreement, or crowdfunding those works, or any other income source, and reach the intermediate tier, you will need, in addition, to provide us with your year's end numbers. In other words, yes, Wizard of the Coast want you to show them your financials. How much money did you make? Prove what tier you belong to. If and only if you are generating a significant amount of money, over $750,000 per year, from your load of works, the revenues you make from your licensed work in excess of $750,000 in a single calendar year is considered qualifying revenue. And you are responsible for paying them 20 or 25% of that revenue. Now, what I do know is if it is crowdfunded, or you do it through Kickstarter, it's 20%. If it was done, if it was crowdfunded or done on any other platform other than Kickstarter, it was 25%. Now, why is that? Why is there a difference? Why do if I use Kickstarter, I only owe you 20% of this additional revenue, but if I use somebody else, I owe you 25%? Well, because they have a deal with Kickstarter. They have work to deal with Kickstarter to push people to use the Kickstarter platform as opposed to any others. That's it. So how enforceable is that, though? Well, again, as I said before a little bit, if you missed it, anything is enforceable up until the point somebody is willing to pay to fight you in court. If you don't have the money to fight it, it's enforceable. If you do fight it, now it is down to IP attorneys and judges and lawyers to figure out how this is going to work. The problem is with a lot of this stuff, you don't know. Because nobody knows. Do you have the money to fight Hasbro in court? They have the money. They could keep you tied up in litigation and drag this out for years. Could you continue to produce your product, roll the dice, no pun intended, and make money, all knowing that there's a possibility it's all going to come crashing down? You got to be pretty damn big to be able to fight that battle, right? So, if you have more than one licensed work, and only some of your licensed work are funded through Kickstarter, they'll modify the tiers and stuff like that. But as I said, there's a lot to this document, but here's what we're going to do, and we're going to kind of give you the takeaways that really apply here. The big difference between the OGL and the new wanted OGL, this is, again to clarify, this is not, even though the intent was that as of Friday this was enforced, it is currently not enforced, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. But because of that, for a third-party content creator, you're giving up the rights to your work, you're paying a large amount of revenue that you didn't have to pay before, and you're having to provide financials to this company. All of these things are things that nobody really wants to do. It's in bad faith, to be honest. And it is not something that this hobby has really been built on. So, with these things being said, here is what has happened over these past few weeks. Knowing that Wizards' intent was to microtransaction and find multiple ways to monetize and force everybody, not just the DM, but every player to have to pay reoccurring money to be able to play D&D. Here is what has occurred. Other than everybody's gone, woe is me, rant, angry, scream, yell, throw my toys out the stroller. Several things have actually happened. One, an awful lot of other content creators on the larger scale, Kobold Press, Paizo, and some of these others, have started putting out their own non-intrusive OGLs and saying, hey, you know what? Right for us. We're not going to ask you for any money. We're not going to do this. Which is kind of a big thing. When I first got into this hobby, many moons ago, Dungeons and Dragons, while was arguably the first role-playing game to come out, certainly within no time at all was not the only one. There were dozens upon dozens upon dozens of different role-playing games covering every genre, every IP you could imagine. There were multiple system-neutral systems out there, like GURPS, which stood for like General Universal Role-Playing System, or something like that, which basically was, here's a set of mechanics, play what the fuck you want with it. You bring the world, you bring the genre, we'll give you a system to use it with. Oh, and here's a bunch of basic stats for a bunch of random stuff that you might want to use, but beyond that, do it yourself. And when that happened, there was an awful lot of choice. Well, all that being said, most of the companies that produce this stuff weren't physically able to maintain and fund their products properly, so a lot of them went under. Bloodbender, absolutely. I mean, that's insane. It could potentially be an insane amount of money that you have to give away. Now, I want to say one little thing, and I'm gonna play devil's advocate for a second. There is one reason and one tiny bit of me that understands where Wizards of the Coast are coming from on the whole, we reserve the right to use your content and to whatever. Here's where I see that. Let's just say I intend to create some new classes. Let's just say I intend to create some new spells. Let's just say I intend to create some new races. We put a ton of work and energy into doing those things, and oh shit, this little third-party content creator over here, Bloodbender, just basically created something so similar to what I was gonna put out. Now I can't do it, or he'll sue me. That is about the only point of justifiable relevance I see in this. Their desire to protect themselves from not being restricted in their creativity, in what they want to create. But you know what? There's 1,000 easier and better ways to do it than what they're trying to do. There is a way that they could have done this where they could have said, look, we reserve the right to do works that are similar to yours. We reserve the right to use and duplicate your stuff. But you still own your work. You still own, but that's something that they don't want to do because it's too sticky, makes too many problems, and it puts them on the defensive. Puts them in a situation where now they're the ones that have got to fight to be able to produce what they want to produce. They don't want that. They want it the other way around. But with all that being said, from a community standpoint, once it became very clear that there was a design or desire to stifle other virtual tabletops, Foundry, Roll20, which we use, and some of these others, and push everything to going to a single license source being D&D Beyond, people got upset. Over the last couple of days, insane amounts of people cancelled their subscriptions to D&D Beyond, to the point that it crashed the servers. Because people were mad, people were upset. Then, and only then, did we see Wizards of the Coast offer any kind of backtrack. What had happened then is they said, well, we're going to put out a 2.0. We're going to create a 2.0. That we get it. This was just an intended draft. Again, I don't buy that because they put a date on it of January 13th. If it's an intended draft, you don't put a date on it. You say to your third content parties, this is what we're thinking about. They put a date on it. They said as of the 13th, this will be in effect. So no. And then they said, yeah, we're gonna have a. We hear you guys. We're gonna put out a 2.0. Well, at this point, they've basically come out and said, oh well, I know we said we're gonna put out a 2.0, but we're not, because when we do put out a document, we want it to be the best, greatest, nicest, superest, fairest document in the land. And we're not quite ready to produce that. Which was a pretty weak response. And at that point is when things become interesting. Now, that is why I'm perpetually saying everything we've gone over in the 1.1, I truly believe, based on what I've heard from former Wizards of the Coast attorneys, from what I've heard verbally from Ryan Dancy, who wrote the original OGL, from what I've heard from several third parties that were approached and given this document, that was absolutely their intent, was to go with the 1.1. That was what they wanted, that was what they intended to do. Now there has been enough backlash that they know that's not okay, and they're not going to get away with it. Jane Ivana is rating us with 22 peoples. What's up? How are you people? What's up, Snuggy? And Chris Tactics, hello. You've missed 90% of what we're talking about, but that's cool, because we're actually, while we're not going to put this up on YouTube, we will publish it unpublished to YouTube, and then we'll link it in the...
What the what?
CD! What's up, brother? We're gonna link it in Discord for everybody to kind of see and go over. But basically, yes. Now, again, keeping things real. Obviously, at this point, 1.1 is not going into effect. As is. There's going to be some changes. There's going to be some backtracking. There's going to be some second thoughts.
What?
Resub.
on how they want to go ahead and proceed. And why? Because third-party content creators and the D&D community have called and waved the BS flag and said, not no, but hell no. Now, I also want to point out something else. This is not the first time they've done this. As we talked about earlier, they, not to this extreme, but they did try to do a little bit of this with 4th edition. What do we know about 4th edition? I'm not going to say it's the worst edition out there, but I think it is fair to say it is largely regarded as the worst edition out there, and it had a kind of a short shelf life, and it really wasn't particularly liked. It was in fact 4th edition that was the birth and the egg that sprung forth Pathfinder and Paizo. Because when 3.5 was under the Open Gaming License, which is what we're talking about, it allowed Paizo to write Pathfinder using the SRD under the OGL and create basically 3.75, if you want to call it that. It had some differences, but fundamentally, if you know how to play D&D 3.5, you know how to play Pathfinder. It's the same game, more or less. You'd have thought they'd learned from that. But the thing to remember is, even if Wizards of the Coast of yesteryear might have learned from that, that doesn't mean Hasbro of this year has learned from that. The CEO of Hasbro, Chris Cox, he is not in tune with D&D as a product. He does not understand the evolution of the game, the passion for the game, and what the game is about. Cynthia Williams, Cynthia Williams is Wizard of the Coast. But I'll point out that both of these CEOs are very new. And do you know where they came from? They both came from very strong digital-based companies. Coincidence? No, it's not a coincidence, because they want to drive D&D into the digital world. As we said, we want a 4-pronged quadrant brand, life brand. We want tabletop role-playing games, we want video games, we want movies, and we want toys and merchandising. And we want it to where even if you don't play D&D, and you're not into the tabletop game itself, we're going to get you on the video games. If I can't get you on the video games, we're going to drag you into the TV shows or through the media. And if we can't do any of those things, we're going to have all kinds of toys and merchandise that your kids are going to want, and you're going to buy it for them, and we're going to get you that way. It's not bad marketing. It's not bad business. But it becomes bad business when you start to bite the hand that feeds you. And that's your third-party content creators. When you start telling them, you got to report your earnings to me if you're going to use the OGL. And, oh, by the way, you're going to pay me this percentage. Oh, and by the way, if you earn more than this, you're going to pay me this percentage of anything above that you earn. And then there's the little part where we're also indicating we're trying to get you out from under this other one, and we'd kill it if we could. Which makes you sit there wondering, okay, so what if I sign this? You're going to try to screw me in a different way sometime down the road? You're going to try to get me another way? Do I want to put all this money out there and then find that I am being successful, and now at this point I'm earning $750,000 and I've now got to give you 25% because I didn't go through Kickstarter? So that's the thing. Also remember that the makers of Pathfinder were largely developers of D&D 2.5 and Wizards and left Amico. Exactly. So it's one of those things that you look at and you understand why, from a business standpoint, why do we have new editions of D&D? Why? Why did we have 2nd edition after, when we had basic D&D and the books and the Moldvay stuff, then we had advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Then we had 2nd edition. Then we had 3rd edition. Then we had 3.5. Then 4. Here's a fact. For the most part, short of rabid dogs, theft, careless players, careless DMs, causing mass catastrophe on your Dungeon Master's Guide, a Dungeon Master only ever spends that money one time. He buys a DMG, he's done. If I want you to buy another DMG, it's got to be different than the one you already got. So, while there is some thought process behind having a better, improving on the edition, let's not lose sight of the fact it's for business reasons. It's for money, folks. Only this time, they're worried less about the production of the books and more about finding ways to make every single person that plays the game pay their way. Again, a couple of key takeaways. The CEO says D&D is under-monetized. They have publicly said 20% of the player base only are the Dungeon Masters, yet the Dungeon Masters are the ones that spend the vast majority of the revenue. They're where Dungeon Masters is where we get our money from, yet they're only 20%. How do we make the other 80% pay as well? And this is part of this whole concept of D&D Beyond, microtransaction, digital-based stuff. If their methodology, if you follow it through, it would seem to be they'll be happy when every single player and every single DM is paying a monthly fee to play Dungeons and Dragons. And however they have to achieve that, that is the goal. Oh, absolutely, Sass. Absolutely there are. Don't be lazy. Produce content. As I said, there's a walk back going on right now, so all is not necessarily doom and gloom, because there is some change. They have realized, because people did hit them where it hurts, the subscription cancellations alone was like, whoa, they're not happy. You know, there's some... One second. There's some thoughts there. One of those thoughts is that we have screamed, we have hollered, we have yelled as a community. And I'm not talking about Howreroll, I'm talking about D&D as a whole. And we've backed them down. There's some truth to that. However, there is also, as several people have pointed out, the fear that if you are a business equivalent of a narcissist, you can take the viewpoint, okay, that's fine. But once we put it out there, and once it's the only new thing, and as long as everybody that we back and everybody that's in the public eye follows suit, sooner or later, they're going to cave. Sooner or later, they're going to pay, and they're going to carry on playing. So, well, that's the point. They had, up to a couple of, as I said, up to a few days ago, they had 13 million people subscribing to D&D Beyond. That's not enough. How dare only 13 million of the player base subscribe? And how dare they only get $5 a month? Hell, that's not even one booster pack in the world of Magic. We're able to make individual players pay $100 a month if they play Magic the Gathering. So how do we replicate that? How do we make that sort of thing? D&D is under-monetized. It's not enough. More, I tell you, more. That's what it comes down to. And again, Hasbro's a business. They are a business. They're not a web-based community that does it as a passion. They're not a community that says, we don't have to give me anything. I'm doing this because I love you and I love doing what I do. They're here to make money. Correct. They purchased D&D Beyond. Correct. Now, a couple of questions that I'm going to answer that I had gotten asked on Facebook Messenger is, does that stop any of us playing on Roll20? The answer is no, it does not. And here's why. For two reasons. One, what may happen is modules, official modules such as Curse of Strahd that we're playing, may not see a port to Fantasy Grounds. They may not see a port to Roll20. They may only be available through D&D Beyond. That doesn't mean, however, that you cannot still play your game or stream your game using Roll20 or Foundry or anything else. It will just mean that they're no longer going to be an official platform. They're going to just yank the rug out from under them in that aspect. Now, the hope, of course, is that the other platforms die. But this is also one of the reasons why I like Roll20. And I'm not saying Roll20 is the best virtual tabletop by any means. But one of the reasons I like it is you can play absolutely any tabletop game on Roll20, not just D&D. You can play Call of Cthulhu, you can play Warhammer, you can play anything. Which brings me to my other point. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of larger companies like Kobold Press and stuff like some of these guys have started to produce and put out their own non-invasive OGLs. There has been more third-party role-playing games advertised in the media over the past couple of weeks than I've ever seen. And what does that mean? It means that the iron grasp that Wizards of the Coast had on role players and on role-playing games, well, it's starting to slip. They squeezed too tight. And in doing so, some other people are starting to say, you know what? This is not your only choice. You can have just as much fun over here with less problems and less intrusion. I'm not going to tell you got to pay me any money. I'm not going to tell you that you got to send me your financials. I want you to produce and content, because here's the truth. Why is D&D so big? It's because of a lot of that third content production. It's because of people streaming it. It's because of people doing digital content. It's all of these things that have allowed it to grow. And inadvertently, it seems to me, that one of the things that Wizards of the Coast have lost the plot on is, as I said, they're biting the hand that feeds them and hurting those that grew them. Now, here's something I'm also going to point out, and I'm going to read it verbatim, and then I'm just going to stand back and say, I get it. Okay? So, everybody, for the longest time, that was anything really officially tied to Wizards of the Coast. Another thing that happened before I go any further is a lot of their content streams were cancelled. Because people would just go into chat, like here, and just blow them up, and yell at them, and scream at them, to the point where they couldn't actually do the content that they wanted. They were just getting blasted by people wanting answers about the OGL. So they actually cancelled a bunch of their streams on their own channel, and said, oh, you know what? They had surveys that were out there. How great is 1D&D? How much do you love it? Yeah, a lot of those went away as well, because they didn't like the responses. So it was a big deal. But while we're talking about streams, and while we're talking about D&D, we all know the reality of the fact is Critical Role, the biggest live stream for Dungeons & Dragons, brought a ton of people into Dungeons & Dragons. They're responsible for that. Prepperjack, thank you so much, man. I appreciate that. Very kind of you, buddy. You shouldn't have done it, but hey, I didn't ask, so I feel OGL safe. They better not steal marks of the intrigue. Well, for example, okay, Giant Rat Guy, perfect example. If I ever wanted to publish Marks of Intrigue, I'd have to change some stuff. When we first started, what I used temporarily for the artwork for the marks wasn't mine to use. If I'd have tried to, I could never monetize that. I would have to have all of that redone. A lot of the monsters and things that you fought, I would have to change. I would have to modify all those to be able to sell it because it wouldn't be SRD and OGL fit to do so. Those are the reasons these things exist, to protect people. And I don't think anybody has a problem with that part. Well, you could use a Rust monster as long as you operate under the OGL and the SRD. That's the thing. You couldn't use a Rust monster if you tried to do it outside of those things, because then you wouldn't be working inside the licensed, acceptable use. You know, as we were saying, so there's that big walk back. We know that there is going to be some changes. They're going to soften their approach, I feel sure. But regardless of that, here's another fact. A lot of collateral damage has already been done that you can't undo. Because as some other people have said, we've always known that Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro were kind of a greedy capitalist company. But they've really shown their true intentions. Now, at this point, they can backtrack. They can soften their approach. But a lot of collateral damage is already done. Is that going to kill D&D? No, it's not going to kill D&D. Is it going to create changes to how they wanted to do things? Yes. It's going to soften things up. But what it's really done is it is... exactly, you're reading my mind better, DM. What it has really done is damaged the trust between the third-party content creator and them. It has damaged the trust of the people that play the game. It's damaged the trust of the people that buy the product. That's going to hurt. Can they overcome it? Sure they can. If they do it right going forward, this is just collateral damage. If they don't do it right going forward, it could be catastrophic. I feel that because of it, we very well could see the last 2 or 3 years of perpetual growth that Dungeons & Dragons has enjoyed be kind of wiped out. And the player base could shrink, potentially. Or, if it doesn't shrink, it will disappear into its own little closet groups. And what I mean by that is, people are going to still play 5e. They're not going to go to 1D&D. People are going to still play 3.5. They're not going to move. They're just going to say, you know what? I'm not buying this. I can still play Dungeons & Dragons. I didn't have a problem with 5th edition. Or, I didn't have a problem with 3.5. I'm going to keep playing what I've already paid for. I'm not giving you any money. I'm not buying into your stuff. That's a very real thing that's very probably going to happen with a lot of people. But if you don't have third-party content providers, then it's down to what can you do? What can you produce? How much stuff can you churn out? And as we said, we go back to using some analogies that we're all familiar with. Skyrim. Why is Skyrim still around and actively playing today? Why do so many people still play Skyrim this many years later? And a vast majority of those is because there's so much modding from a third-party community that are putting out quality mods and keeping the game alive. That's what does it. It's the same with Fallout 4 and some of these other games. Those are the things that keep something beyond its shelf life. And if you take that away, if you wipe that out, you're limiting. And here's the thing that you can know about people and how fickle they are. And that is, If you don't give me product to buy and something new to invest in and something new and shiny to look at, there's a chance my attentions will change. I will look over here instead of concentrating here. That's a thing that third-party content creators do. They keep the new, they keep the shiny, they keep the thing that's, keeps pushing something in front of you that you didn't see before, keeps you engaged, keeps you moving forward. A lot of the older school players, such as myself, if it's good, I'll buy it. If it's not, I probably won't. I don't need to. I've got so much old material that I can regurgitate. But that being said, for the newer players, it's not the case. The newer players want something. I want to spend my money on my hobby. I want to spend my money on my passion. That ideology isn't flawed. I think Hasbro understand that, but it's how they want to acquire that wealth from you. That's your problem. How they want to get this cash out of you, the player, and out of the third-party content creators. That's the issue. A lot has been vocalized. A lot of people have yelled, a lot of people have hollered, and people have been heard. What will that mean? How will it change? We don't know yet. I sincerely hope that it puts them on the back foot and they back down a good bit. They need to. Again, I can tell you a lot of people are very jaded by 1D&D because of this. They've damaged the future brand of that endeavor. But there is some good that has come from this. There is some good. And the good is third-party games are starting to be seen. Other games, other than just Dungeons & Dragons, are starting to get a little bit of limelight. Their 15 minutes of fame. And people are going to start looking. People are going to start going over here and playing some of the other fantasy role-playing games that are out there. They're going to play some other IPs that exist. They're going to be doing things like digging into playing role-playing games built around their favorite IPs. I'm a huge Star Wars fan. I'm going to play Star Wars role-playing game. I love Star Trek. I'm going to play the Star Trek role-playing game. I want to play Call of Cthulhu. I want to play the Alien role-playing game. I want to stick with a fantasy genre, but I know there are other things other than D&D out there. So what other fantasy games are out there? Well, there's a bunch of them. There's also non-specific systems like Fate, the core rule system, or GURPS, which are just systems that you can tell your stories with. You don't have a actual game. There is the Cypher system and Numenera. There is Kobold Press are putting out their own mechanics soon. There's a lot of these things that are happening that, because of this, are going to get a whole lot more exposure. And it's going to be good for them. And I'll be careful as I say this, it's fairly well known that while Dungeons & Dragons is arguably the largest system, it isn't necessarily the best system. There are other role-playing games out there that, in my opinion, have a better game system. If you want an alternate to a fantasy setting, there is Pathfinder, there is Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, there is Zweihander. There are some other games out there that people can look to go to. There is, for example, Tortured Earth. Mork Borg, there you go, there's another one. So There's a lot of other stuff out there. And the more exposure that they get, and the more people are willing to give those a chance, the better for our hobby. Because what happens is, we get choice, which is a good thing, and we take power away from those companies that currently have a monopoly and may not necessarily have our best interests at heart as players. But, you know, that's the facts. As I said, personally, and I've segmented this off from the rest of the conversation. Personally, I have looked at the playtest stuff for 1D&D. I've examined it. I've dabbled with it. I haven't seen anything there yet that makes me think, oh my god, this is so much better than 5e. I can't wait for this. No. And if I'm going to have to pay a convoluted way to be able to get my content other than just buy a damn book, no. I am quite happy to play 5th edition if I want to play D&D, or 3.5. I am more than happy to enjoy what I consider a better system with Pathfinder, or with Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, or Call of Cthulhu. I'm not married to Dungeons and Dragons. We play D&D, it's because it was the big one that people would know. It's what everybody would kind of understand. And it is something that is marketed to the point where, at this point, you might not understand what Dungeons and Dragons is, but unless you are really living under a rock, you know it's a game. You might not know what it's about and how it works, but you know what it is. You've heard those words, Dungeons and Dragons. So that's it. Beta DM, you say that, but again, it wasn't Chris Cox that said D&D was under-monetized. It was Cynthia Williams. She's the CEO of Wizards. Do I believe that by being acquired by Hasbro has changed how Wizards view things and changed how they have to do things going forward? Absolutely. I can believe that maybe Chris Perkins and people like that don't really want this. I can believe that. But they're not the company. Their current CEO is on board with this methodology. So, you know. Either way you look at it, Wizards of the Coast is under Hasbro. They're the ones... It's like saying Hasbro is the ones holding the leash, and when they let the attack dog go, it's the dog that bites you, and the dog was Wizards. So the Wizards bit you, but... no, it was... it was Cynthia Williams who said it was under-monetized. I don't believe it was Chris Cox. I could be wrong, but I think that's what I read. Now you're making me double-check it. But, you know, regardless, you gotta... What they wanted to put out, the 1.1 document that they had, that they said was just a draft, and again, if it was just a draft, you wouldn't have said goes into effect January 13th. Any content produced after this date falls under this. You wouldn't have done that. That wouldn't have been on there. Was it leaked? Yes. We weren't meant to see it. It was only people like Trollord Games and Paizo and Kobold Press and Palladium and all these other companies that were supposed to have seen it. But it's pretty much been confirmed. While several third-party content creators leaked it, I'm pretty sure now that they think that there were some people inside of Wizards of the Coast that leaked it as well. I cannot confirm or deny that. I'm only saying what I heard. But I'm not going to knee-jerk and say I'm not playing Dungeons & Dragons anymore. Not going to do that. I am going to say that they're going to have to do something pretty special with D&D Beyond and 1D&D to get me to go anywhere near it. So that's it, you know. But on Thursdays, we will continue to dabble in and play other games. We'll continue to concentrate on telling stories and having fun and worry less about what platform we use to do it. And I think that's the biggest thing. Howreroll's goal is to provide fun and entertainment. We have said from day one, don't concentrate on the system or the mechanics, concentrate on the story. And that's what we do. So, you know, we're fully aware that in the future, if all things are said to have been played out, and 1D&D is the thing, there are going to be some people that only want to see 1D&D content. Okay, you know what? There will be streams for you. I hope that our core audience isn't here because we play 5e or because we play 3.5. Hopefully they're here because we suck and they like to watch us and laugh at us. In partial defense and in partial explanative, I will say this. Critical Role finally broke silence and said, Critical Role has always supported creators and games developers in the tabletop space. We stand by our industry peers, as well as anyone who takes a risk creating a new system or developing an original idea. The beauty of gaming comes from the opportunity to share inclusive, diverse, and compelling stories from a wide spectrum of creators. That's exactly why we launched our own game publishing company a few years ago. Remember that? Because we believe that broadening the field of creators boosts the entire industry. The success we have experienced is thanks to the passion and interest of the greater tabletop community, and we commit to fostering an environment that allows everybody the opportunity to easily share their stories that they will tell. Now, in defense, what else could they say? What else can they say? Right now, Critical Role are China to me. We don't like what's going on in the Ukraine. We're not happy with it. But not really in a place where we can rock the boat too much because we kind of stuck with this. We kind of can't come out and say anything too harsh. So while I do agree it was a weak statement, I understand it. I get it. I know why they said what they said. I got nothing to lose. You know, Howreroll doesn't really have the monetization that is associated with it like they do. But again, they're, you know, between a rock and a hard place. Somebody said, worst mistake they ever made was ditching Pathfinder to move to D&D. I think we all know why they did that. Because they would have never enjoyed the success if they were playing Pathfinder that they do playing Dungeons & Dragons. Because D&D is the brand. It is the game. It is the big elephant. But the bottom line is, there are legal contracts at play. There are obligations. There are things that they're held under. They can't just throw caution to the wind and, you know, yell and scream and holler and condemn Wizards of the Coast. It would hurt their brand as well. I'd like to think that there is some sincerity in the fact that they are saying what they kind of mean. We are on the side of the creators. We do believe this, that, and the other. But it was interesting to me that they even pointed out, hey, we have our own little publication system too. Almost like, you know, the door's open. So, and the only reason I bring that up is just to point out how even somebody like them are potentially so tied in to the bureaucracy and the legalities of these sort of things, that in no small feat do you have to acknowledge how powerful something like the open game license is to someone that's producing third-party content using the SRD. You know, a lot of people have said, screw it, I'll just go back to the OSR, old school rules. You can. Go back to anything that was produced before the OGL, do what the hell you want. But, you know, as a couple of people in chat have pointed out, there are better ways to achieve what you're trying to achieve. That's just it. Correct, exactly. D&D Beyond has been their biggest sponsor. And currently, D&D Beyond's name is Mud. Rock, hard place, critical role. Understand that. So, you know. So the reason I brought that up, as I said, is I don't want them. I don't feel it's fair to judge them too harshly. But at the same time, let's not lose sight of where their bread is buttered as well. So I fully expect that Critical Role will be moving to 1D&D and playing exclusively on D&D Beyond, and all of those things are going to probably happen, very likely, and they're going to follow along like good little soldiers, because they're going to have to, because it's too lucrative for them not to. What's up, Ninja? So, yeah, that's kind of it, in a nutshell. Wait and see what happens. The collateral damage has already been done. It's opened up a huge door for a lot of other games to start to try to get out there and produce content. And that's only a good thing. It really is. As I said, we're not going to put this up live on YouTube. We will put it up on YouTube unpublished, but we will then provide a link to Discord for everybody that missed it or wants to go over it again. But at this point, I'll just throw it over to any questions, and if I can answer them, I will do my best. Is mayonnaise an instrument? It could be. You can play mayonnaise. I'm afraid to ask much. No, ask it. I don't mind repeating myself. If I've already covered it, it just means I've already covered it, so I know what to say. Ironically, I can tell you, Gary Gygax would have probably loved the new OGL. He was never a fan of the open gaming license, but then he come from a different world, and he wanted to firmly control Dungeons and Dragons. Someone said Gary be rolling in his grave. I don't think he would have been. I think he'd have been, hey, I get it. I don't want other people making money off of my product. He wouldn't have understood the third-party content creator is a good thing. Okay, and just to confirm, because I didn't want to put out, yes, Wizards of the Coast president, Cynthia Williams, told investors in December that the brand is really under-monetized. So it was indeed Cynthia Williams, and not the CEO, Chris Cox of Hasbro. Never understood the OGL. Could I use attributes plus D20 as mechanics? Yes, Semerif. One of the things I covered is it has been ruled and tested and held up. You cannot copyright game mechanics. Cannot do it. You can only copyright terminology. So you totally can do that. They cannot stop you. What specifically, if anything, have they already walked back on since the uproar? Specifically, nothing. Other than basically saying, hey, we're going to put out a no OGL, and then saying, actually, we're not ready to do that yet because we got more thinking to do. So they didn't really, honestly, walk back anything other than acknowledge the fact that everybody's mad. It was a fairly weak response. As somebody pointed out, they used an awful lot of words to not really say anything. But yeah, Semirif, one of the things we was discussing near the start, while you cannot, as I said, you cannot copyright or trademark a game mechanic, you can with the, I've seen Les Placid takes in a retirement home, exactly. You can potentially copyright terminology. So the example I gave is, in card games, there are tons of card games where you, quote-unquote, tap a card to get an effect. They cannot stop you saying turn, twist, use. Legally, though, they do own the copyright of the word tap. Therefore, you cannot say tap in the descriptions of your card game. Somebody said, well, what if they... Could they copyright the terminology armor class? Possibly. Possibly. Because it's fairly specific. They couldn't copyright armor. They couldn't copyright class. Armor class? Possibly. It would be down to the courts to decide. However, even if they won, it's, instead of AC or armor class, it's your armor rating. It's your protection statistic. It's, again, all you got to do is change the terminology. I watched a good interview with an attorney who pointed out you could absolutely recreate Dungeons and Dragons in its entirety as long as you changed the right terminology. 3d6 to create a statistic or an attribute. You can't copyright that. It's a mechanic. Right, that's it. And think about it. Class or level. Look how many video games use the terminology level. Look how many games use the terminology level. Look at how much stuff uses class. The amount of lawsuits that you would have to fight and defend to just to get those two copyrighted. Man. Right. Right, yeah. So, you know, while we're talking about that, you know, things like beholders, carrion crawlers, displacer beast, the Gith Yankee and Gith Zeri, Mind Flayer, Umber Hulk, Slod, Yuan Tees, all of those are actually, they are actually copyrighted terms. But that doesn't mean that people haven't been able to acquire the licensing or the ability to use them by contacting Wizards of the Coast or whoever. Right, patents and copyrights are a different animal altogether. Right. That's right. And then some of them, Some of the monsters are actually copyright held by the creator of the monster, and they're not belonged by anybody. For example, the Boule, I believe, is copyright and owned by Tim Kask, and was never handed over to TSR, and therefore was not acquired by Wizards of the Coast. Fun fact. That being said, they've been given the rights to use it. But the point being, I don't think Wizards could sue you if you use Boule, but Tim Kask could. False Hydra, I don't think is one of those that's copyrighted. I know most of them, but I don't profess to know every single one. I think that French actor Juicy Smollett owns a pet Boule, right? Oh man, the Boule. The number of arguments I have seen online about whether it should be called, whether the pronunciation is Boule or Bullet. You got people arguing real world language statistics and makeup versus the fantasy implications. It's so hilarious. What about the dice system itself? I mean, it would be absurd to think a D6 dice could be owned, but a D48... Nope. Again, couldn't own... You can't really own those. You could only own any terminology that was specifically applied to them. Again, so... Could you argue that you might be able to argue saving throw? It's a pretty generic term, so you might struggle to do it in a court of law, but it's not infeasible or unfeasible to think it could be done. What would that mean? It means that if saving throw became under a patent and ownership and copyright as a term, as we said, it's no longer a saving throw. You just change the terminology. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people don't bother. Because even if you win, what do you achieve? If you spend hundreds of thousands of dollars copywriting the term armor class, so everybody then starts just calling it armor factor, what did you win? What did you achieve? You didn't stop anybody doing anything. So, you know. And as with everything, until it's actually been tested in court, and a precedence has been set, nobody knows. It is all up to interpretation. You know, as I said, a lot of attorneys have weighed in and said that they cannot dissolve the OGL. But nearly all of them have agreed that doesn't stop them having an OGL 1.1 to govern future product. Just means they can't they can't go backwards and say, we're taking this away from you now. Exactly, Shaggy. And that's the thing. Even if Hasbro has the money to do it, do they have the manpower to fight every single company that dared to, so... And you also have to understand there is a thing called precedence. Going back on what Beta DM just said. If you allow something to stand long enough, you then open yourself up to legal jeopardy to be challenged on why do you now have a problem with it. So that's the thing. It's one of those things where, at this point, if they did go back and try to patent some of these terminologies, they'd be like, yeah, but you never bothered before, why now? And again, you've also got to look at the sheer spectrum that it would cover. Like we said, someone saying, could they patent level to indicate character level? Yeah, but how many video games you want to go after? So, that's it. the reality of it is creating a new OGL to cover future content is not a terrible idea. The problem is how greedy the intentions were, and how much money and how kind of all of your base are belong to us if you use this kind of happened to be. So the first modules for both original D&D and 3rd edition were third-party publications, right? I mean, even Dungeons & Dragons, back in the day, in its infancy, had its fair share of getting sued for using terminology it shouldn't have used. And it's why things like Displacer Beast, you can own the rights to. Elf, you can't. Dwarf, you can't. Having a D&D marketplace where third parties can submit to their store and Wizard gets a cut is actually a great idea. Again, there's a point where it's okay. It's how far do you take it? Start demanding 25% of everything over 750,000, you're going to have people upset. Well, and that's just it, Beta DM. You can kind of already do that because you can produce something under the OGL, but that doesn't give you the right to use the logo. But you can use the logo and the actual D&D brand by acquiring a separate license, because there is actually a license that you can get that allows you to do that and put that on your publications. But as we were saying before, but if you do that, then it opens you up to a whole bunch of other rules and regulations and stuff like that. And also you've got to remember that in 2017, late 2017, Wizards created a fan content policy, which allowed fans to kind of do certain things under the IP as long as it wasn't to try to make money, as it were. And as long as it wasn't done in any way to be considered malicious towards D&D. Love Murder Rose, yes, exactly. That's kind of what I was saying before is, you've got to kind of pick an avenue. If you want to charge a per license instance and say, okay, you know what, you have to pay us this much for each product. That's one revenue, as long as it's fair. A sensible percentage. But to say, if you turn out over 750,000, we get 25%. Oh, and by the way, we still own the intellectual rights to all the stuff that you produce. Yeah, I get it. That's right. General fantasy races aren't copyrighted, and nor can they be. So that's right. Elf, dwarf, orc, ogre, things like that, you couldn't do it with. Laura Murder Rose, again, exactly right. It specifically says gross revenue, not profit. So, 25% of your gross. Now, if we can take this just one more step before I jump off here. So think about this. If you have a product that you believe you can sell, and that you believe it will create more than $750,000 of sales, do you increase the cost that you want for the product. You increase the recommended retail price of that product in anticipation that that will happen, because you need to cover that 25%. Because back in the day, I used to own a role-playing game store. And most things, you had an average of about a 40% markup as a reseller. So if a book cost $20, or if a book was going to retail for $19.99, I got it for about math is hard. But I basically paid 60% of what that was worth, so that 40% of that was profit to me, right? So yeah, 12. There you go. So if it was a $20 product, I paid 12. I made $8. Now, that's the thing to think about. If that 25% cuts into that 40%, that only leaves you 15%. That's not a lot of revenue. So do you have to sell your product at a 65% markup in order to make enough money to... These are all the things that you got to kind of look at, and that's why so many people are upset. You know, it's a lot of money that they're asking for. And then on top of that, they want to own it and keep the rights to your work, which for any creator, I don't care whether you're a content creator, whether you're an artist, whether you're a sculptor, whatever you are, nobody wants to give the rights to their own stuff away, right? So that's another big part. So anyway, guys, as I said, this won't go on our YouTube channel because I just don't want to put this out for public consumption. It's largely my take as well as a lot of information. As I said, we looked at both the the OGLs, and we went through the highlights together. But it will be put up just non-findable, non-published, and we will provide a link to it in the Discord. So anybody that wants to watch it and kind of digest it. Again, at this point, things are still changing. I'm going to get there, bud. Things are still changing. Don't know where they're going to land. But there's enough happened that I felt there was a reason to have a discussion. Okay, so before we go, Thursday the 26th of January, we will have a special fundraiser on Howreroll. It is a one-shot. I won't give you too much information other than it's going to be an awful lot of fun. And it is in aid of our very own Dragon Spooker. She had some very bad news here recently, and is in a position where she kind of needs a little bit of help. So we're going to do a fundraiser to try to help raise some money, and do what we can. There's information about it on the Discord. There is a GoFundMe. What we're going to do is ask as many of you to show up and show your support as you can. If you can donate, fantastic. But if all you can do is share the GoFundMe or get other people to come and hang out in the stream so that they might donate, that's cool too. So, as we said, it is one of those things that when we do St. Jude fundraisers, when we've done fundraisers for communities in the past, we do what we can, right? We ask you only to do what you can. We don't want anybody to put themselves in any kind of financial dire straits or whatever, or spend any monies that they can't. So if you want to support, but financially and not where you can do that, just get the word out. Share the GoFundMe. Put it out. Anyway, guys, thank you so much. I've had a blast. Hope you did too. Monday, of course, is MLK. There won't be a stream. Thursday, I am out of town Tuesday till Thursday. I believe I'm going to make it back in time for the Thursday stream, as long as I can get out of the conference a little bit sharp, and as long as traffic isn't atrocious. So at this point, the intent is to have a stream on Thursday, If anything happens and I'm stuck in traffic or don't make it, I will let everybody know, of course, on Twitter. But that's the plan. Everybody have a great extended weekend. If you're off tomorrow, lucky you. And hope this was useful to you. As I said, several of you reached out and said, hey, can you dig into this for me a little bit and give us your thoughts. Hopefully we've achieved that today. Y'all take care. Much love. Bye, y'all.